This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, that was a powerful scene from a very powerful movie, Spike Lee's Malcolm X. And in that scene, you see Malcolm X in action. And it's interesting that that's one of the few scenes that really show Malcolm X as a person capable of mobilizing people for action in the context of the African American freedom struggle, in this case an incident of police brutality. How many of you have seen the film, by the way? Okay, nearly all of you. What did you draw from that scene? Just I'd like to get your sense of what Spike Lee is very skilled, tremendous filmmaker. What was he trying to get you to feel in that scene? Yes.
Well, it seemed like it's showing the appeal to just like an average black man on the street, seeing that man stopped and tracks and it's like, whoa. So that's sort of like the appeal, why people would join us.
And what happens at the beginning of the scene to kind of set it up? What's the woman in the crowd say?
Like the Muslims, they talk, they're good talk, but they don't actually do anything unless something happens to them. Okay,
so she says, they're just all talk. There are no action unless somebody bothers Muslims. Okay, so that's the setup for the scene. Malcolm X is looking at this woman, taking that message. Then the scene happens. What else do we draw from that? Yeah.
He almost like leads them with precision, like he's a military, like he's a general in the military, and then everyone else is just following precisely. They all march straight. They're silent. They just
Okay. Yeah, he says they're very disciplined, as opposed to the people who are in the background who are just kind of yelling and very upset about what's happening, but the people following him are quiet. He says, the police, you got to take care of the masses in the background, but I'll take care of the people who follow me because they're very disciplined. So he's making that distinction. What else? Those of you who were here a little bit earlier when the previous scene had to do with Malcolm and women, and especially Sister Betty, how do you see those working together? What happens in that earlier scene for those of you who are here?
You see an empowerment of women as opposed to, say, like the SCLC, which or NAACP would kind of use the women, but they weren't in leadership positions. You have this woman who is...
Okay, and Sister Betty being a person, but is she in a position of power?
Well, I mean, I guess she's not Malcolm X and she wasn't a minister, but she's definitely like talking to him as an equal, and he's treating her like an equal.
Okay. She's obviously somebody who's worthy of his respect, and he gives that respect. There's actually a scene earlier where he gets advice from Elijah Muhammad on what he should look for in a woman. Anyone remember anything about that? What does he say? Well, he mentions things like half your age plus 7 as an ideal age for a woman who's going to be his wife. And you get Malcolm X kind of repeating the advice in terms of his questions. Why is he asking the question about her height? Because that was part of it. You want somebody about the same height. So he's in terms of women, he's portraying Malcolm X as somewhat inept, but in need of guidance from the father figure, Elijah Muhammad, and it turns out that is a major part of his selection of his wife. He does rely on his advice. So anything else about this about the film? When would you guess that the incident with Brother Johnson took place? Any guess? I mean, you've read a lot of history. Where would you place it in that history?
Late 1950s.
What?
Late 1950s.
Okay, why late 1950s?
this just when Malcolm still head of Muslim the mosque number 7 in Harlem?
Okay, how long does that last till? When does he leave that position? 63, 64 actually. So it could have been any time before that in terms of that reason. What else? Just in terms of the level of militancy.
And then to me it shows the transition between the pure civil rights movement to the emergence of Black Power movement.
Okay. So you'd probably guess a little bit later?
Yeah, a little bit 60s.
Yeah, yeah.
Just judging by like the cards they use, probably like 54, 55.
Okay, well, that's actually a good way of guessing in terms of a film. But it takes place in 1957. And it's interesting that in the autobiography, in Malcolm X's autobiography, he uses that phrase by the woman that Spike Lee takes in the film, and about how the Muslims are all talk, they talk a good game, but when it comes to action, there's nothing there unless somebody bothers Muslims. But the comment in Malcolm X's autobiography comes in 1963 in the context of Birmingham. So he's basically saying at the time of Birmingham, people were increasingly saying that the Muslims are all rhetoric, they talk a lot, but they're not willing to do anything. And it's interesting that in the autobiography, that's used as a stimulus for Malcolm's transition out of the Nation of Islam, because he sees that as a criticism of the Nation of Islam. While in the film, Spike Lee uses it as a setup piece that basically says the Nation of Islam is the answer to the criticism. But if you think about it, that's a contradiction, because the woman is saying Muslims don't do anything unless somebody bothers Muslims, so what is the action? They're doing something in terms of someone bothering, in this case, beating up a member of the Nation of Islam. So it's a lot of mixed messages. It's interesting that if you watch the film, and this is, I think, a testimony to Spike Lee's power as a filmmaker, is that a lot of these questions don't occur to you. It's the way you go to a really good film, especially a good action film or a suspense film, and you get caught up in it, and then after the movie you're talking about it with a friend, and you see all these holes in it, in terms of it doesn't quite intellectually, the plot doesn't quite intellectually make sense, but while you're wrapped up in the emotion of it, from one scene to the next, if you're in the hands of a powerful filmmaker, it all makes emotional sense. And it's interesting for me because as a historian who has written about Malcolm X, I went to the Spike Lee film with a different kind of attitude about it. I ended up writing several reviews of the film that were somewhat critical because of just that aspect of it, that giving him credit for his skill and power as a filmmaker, but at the same time raising some historical questions. And among these historical questions have to do with the issue of the mythology of Malcolm X. How much do we attribute to one individual in terms of a major social struggle? It's the same question that I would raise about Martin Luther King, and have raised about Martin Luther King. Was Martin Luther King responsible for the movement? I think you know enough now to know, from Awele's lecture and other things that you've read, that many other people were responsible, that the Montgomery bus boycott would have occurred without Martin Luther King. Certainly, with respect to Malcolm X, a lot of these mass activities during the 1950s and 60s certainly would have happened without Malcolm X, because he really wasn't a civil rights leader. If anything, he was a critic of the civil rights movement. But he definitely was not guiding the activities. And that's part of his response to Birmingham, because his attitude was always that the leaders of the civil rights struggle were, first of all, misguided, because they wanted something that the society was not going to give, and that was integration. And secondly, they lacked courage, because they were not militant enough in terms of the tactics and strategies that they wanted to use. Specifically with respect to Martin Luther King, he criticized him because of his nonviolence. But when we turn the critical gaze from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, some of those same criticisms come to the fore. To what extent is Malcolm X a leader of a political struggle? He's certainly a leader within a religious organization. But is that organization, does it have a political message? Does it have a strategy to fit that political message? Is he guiding African Americans toward a political goal in a militant way? And I think when we look at it that way, we see that many of these same criticisms apply to Malcolm X, that he was a leader in search of a movement, often responding to events, and particularly responding to the upsurge of mass activism in the 1963 period. Now, I think with Malcolm X, what we see is a leader torn between his loyalty to Elijah Muhammad and the his loyalty to Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, which took him from his earlier life, and I think the most effective scenes in Spike Lee's film are about Malcolm X's transition from his earlier life as a criminal and the way in which the Nation of Islam turns him into a person who has great leadership qualities. But Malcolm X is not satisfied with that. There's a number of reasons why he's not, and this, I think, leads to his split with Elijah Muhammad. Now, in the film, how is that split explained? What happens in the film? Yes?
Like, I believe, Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah, Elijah Muhammad has some illegitimate children that Malcolm X finds out about. So he has this disillusionment with his father figure, who he sees as a moral exemplar until he finds out about the illegitimate children. And that undermines his sense of regard for Elijah Muhammad, so therefore he eventually breaks with him. Well, what could be another explanation for that break? What I would suggest is that it's the politics of it. That Malcolm X is getting very restless. You know, here he is in a apolitical religious organization that is waiting for Allah to bring about change. Now that might make sense in the early 1950s when Malcolm X first comes into the Nation of Islam. There wasn't very much movement going on. There's no mass activity. So you could imagine somebody being drawn into this organization, seeing it has great potential. But what happens as the 50s with not only Montgomery happening in the United States, but what's happening internationally? Yes?
Liberation of Ghana.
Liberation of Ghana, other African nations, Asian nations, the Bandung Conference, 1955 in Indonesia. What's that all about? Does anyone recognize that term?
You're talking about the Bandung Conference?
Yeah.
It was about the I guess, of third world countries, nations in Africa and Asia, kind of exerting their...
Yeah, for the first time, the non-aligned nations, the ones who don't see the world in east-west, communist, non-communist terms, they want to stay out of the Cold War. They want to develop on their own, independent of both the United States and the Soviet Union, nations like Indonesia, India, most of the African nations. So they are asserting themselves in the world. And Malcolm X always sees that conference of non-aligned nations as something that has significance to African Americans, that we should ally ourselves with those nations. And that this will help the African American struggle. He wants to bring the question of African American rights to the United Nations, because he feels that the United Nations is changing with the entry of all of these new nations, and that could provide leverage to bring about the changes that we want in the United States, and that it's in the interests of African Americans to do that. Now, this is the same argument that within this class we've had Paul Robeson making that argument, Du Bois making that argument, particularly after World War II, with the formation of the United Nations. That's why Du Bois comes to San Francisco in 1955, tries to get the issue of both colonization and the suppression of rights because of race. He wants to put these issues before this United Nations. Now, that doesn't happen because the United States doesn't want it to happen. That's the struggle over the founding of the United Nations. But it does get expressed through the International Declaration of Human Rights. And that distinction is one that Malcolm makes all the way through the 1950s and into the 60s. The distinction between human rights, that is, the rights that everyone around the world should have, and it's something that links African Americans and Asians and Africans, and civil rights, which he sees as that's just what you're asking the United States government to give you, and they're not going to give you that anyway. So you can see Malcolm X struggling within the confines of this organization as the black struggle expands during the 50s and into the 60s, and particularly when we get to that crucial year, 1963. And that's when everything comes to a head. So the fact that he has this disagreement, or at least disillusionment with Elijah Muhammad based on the issue of illegitimacy, is combined with his disillusionment in being in an apolitical organization at a time when African American politics is exploding on every front. Now, when we see the Spike Lee film, I think that there's a number of aspects of it that I can use as a way of jumping off into a discussion of the real Malcolm X as opposed to the mythological Malcolm X. The mythological, when we say mythological, does it mean that it's necessarily untrue? Probably not. That's not the way I would take it. I would simply mean that that the cultural truth sometimes has greater importance than the historical truth. The cultural truth would be that African Americans needed a person like Malcolm X. He served definite cultural needs. For most African Americans, the notion of male assertiveness, a male who can take care of his family, a person who could stand up to white people, all of these cultural needs are served by a historical persona called Malcolm X. To some degree, the historical persona is actually the mythological persona. But there are points where they don't fit together. And that would be true, I guess, again, with any other person, with a Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. All of these are people who have mythological meaning in terms of America's need for a heroic figure, and for African Americans' need. And Malcolm X, of course, is one of these, and Martin Luther King is one of these. So I think we always have to look at both sides of these individuals. Now, with respect to Malcolm X, let me just say a few words about how the historian in me and other people have kind of looked at Malcolm X. It's only been in recent years that the critical study of Malcolm X has developed. For most of the period since his death in 1965, Malcolm X's public image has been shaped by one book, the autobiography of Malcolm X. Now, just imagine if our understanding of Richard Nixon was limited to the autobiography of Richard Nixon, or just about any other figure that you would want to take. We wouldn't accept that as the basis for what we know. We would want to we'd use that as a starting point, just as we might use the autobiography of Martin Luther King. But any serious historian would want to look beyond that and try to determine to what extent does that image that is put forward in the book fit the historical reality. Now, it turns out that Spike Lee relied a great deal on the autobiography for his film. The film starts with a scene about Malcolm X's father. Actually, it's a flashback scene after the film gets started, and he goes back. And the portrayal of the father, I think, is the beginning of Spike Lee's development of this kind of mythological character. What was significant about Malcolm X's father? Okay, he was killed by a KKK member. What else? Why was he killed?
Because they were attacking his neighbor and he shot at him with a gun in their direction to scare him away, saying that, we're not going to be scared of you. Don't come around here anymore. Okay.
His father was somebody who fit that image that Malcolm X wanted to fit. That is, someone who was willing to stand up to white people. He was killed for it. That implants a memory in Malcolm X's mind of he wants to kind of both improve upon his father by being a successful black militant, but he uses that as a model. Now, it's interesting that the actual circumstances of his father's death are much more complex. It's not even clear that a racist was responsible for the death of Malcolm X's father. One of the reasons why the historians debate that is that there was an insurance policy, and so therefore there was an investigation about the death, and no one was ever found responsible, and according to the investigation, it was ruled an accident. Now, Malcolm X at the time was too young to understand one way or the other. He would have found out this from stories that other people told within the family, and you can easily see how the family would have resented the fact that they did not get a payoff on their insurance policy, because the death was ruled a suicide, basically, that his father had gotten drunk and fallen over a railroad track and been hit by a railroad car. Now, all of this becomes part of Malcolm X's, in the autobiography, part of his resentment, that he holds white people responsible for his father's death. And in a larger sense, that's probably true, because what happens to the family is that they become destitute, dependent upon white society. But for Malcolm X, what that also means is that he's raised by white people. He's placed in foster homes. Much of his early upbringing is the result of the care that he gets in these foster homes. Now, I think that the way I would look at this is compare Malcolm X's early life with Martin Luther King's early life. Both of them are the sons of people who had been Baptist ministers. Malcolm X's father becomes a black nationalist affiliated with Marcus Garvey. Martin Luther King's father becomes a civil rights leader affiliated with the NAACP. Both of them, both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, grow up in households where they fear for their father's life. And in Malcolm X's case, that fear is realized because his father is killed, even as he's still very young. For Martin Luther King, there was this fear that his father would be killed because of his civil rights activity. Martin Luther King is raised in a very stable home environment, black environment of black Atlanta, goes to a black college, raised within a black family. For Malcolm X, his life is actually much more, involves much more integration with white society, but in a very negative way. Foster homes, schools that he doesn't like. He sees the underside of white society in terms of crime, drugs, other things. In terms of his own attitudes, I think what we see is that Malcolm X learns to despise white society. Martin Luther King, until he gets well into his teenage years, has very little contact with white society and develops a more optimistic, ultimately more optimistic view of that society. Which one is most realistic? Well, it depends on what side of white society you were looking at. Certainly from Malcolm X's point of view, white society didn't look very good. By the time we get to their formative years, Martin Luther King wants to model himself on his father, and his father's model is ever present. That's the model he uses to go into the ministry. For Malcolm X, it's a substitute father. It's Elijah Muhammad. For Martin Luther King, I think that the notion of being reborn and taking a new name would have been inconceivable. He liked the name Martin Luther King Jr. That was part of his positive identity. For Malcolm X, taking on a new identity as a member of the Nation of Islam allowed him another chance in life. So we can see a lot of differences and similarities. Once we get to the late 1950s, though, I think that what I'd like to emphasize is that both of them had a great deal of similarities with respect to their relationship to the black struggle. Both of them wanted to assert leadership of that struggle. Martin Luther King had a lot of advantages from his background, his connections through his family. All of these, his education, all of these gave him advantages. When we see the letters that Malcolm X begins to write to Martin Luther King, both criticizing him but also reaching out to him, and Martin Luther King not answering those letters. These letters start in the late 50s, Malcolm X usually inviting Martin Luther King to come to a Muslim rally and debate him, or at least be part of a political discussion. You can imagine Martin Luther King saying, "What do I have to gain from doing that?" And just kind of having someone on his staff writing a letter saying, "Thank you for your letter, but I don't have really time on my schedule to join your rally." But understanding it from Malcolm's point of view, here is a person who is very confident of his ability to express his point of view, someone who feels that he should be asserting leadership in the black community, that he should basically be in Martin Luther King's position, and if he was, black people would be much better off. And I think that that kind of sense of resentment comes to the fore in Malcolm X's rhetoric toward Martin Luther King. That Malcolm X feels that if only he could assert leadership in the black community and perhaps have the advantages of a Martin Luther King, that the black community would be much better served. And you can kind of see, I'll talk a little bit later about Jesse Jackson. And I think that there's a lot of similarities there too, because Jesse Jackson, growing up not in as a illegitimate child, someone from a relatively poor background, seeing other people with greater advantages asserting leadership in the black community, but feeling very strongly that he is the person best served to offer that leadership. Well, Malcolm X definitely felt that. Now, I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about Malcolm X's relationship with Elijah Muhammad. It's a very complex one. I think to me, the nature of that relationship is revealed in Malcolm's attitude toward women, because he does, both in the film and in the autobiography, reflect a lot of Elijah Muhammad's notions about the role of women. That the role of women is not to be the equal of man. The role of women is to be supportive of men. And Elijah Muhammad was very assertive in terms of guiding the private life of the members of the Nation of Islam, and particularly Malcolm X, who reaches almost the age of 30 before he's married. I think he's actually 30 about the time he meets Betty, Sister Betty, and when they are married, it's with the recommendation of people around Elijah Muhammad, and they basically tell Malcolm X, you, as a leader within this organization, you have to find a wife. It's interesting that a little bit earlier, people around Martin Luther King are telling him the same thing, and that kind of leads to that as a black minister, you have to have a wife, and he feels that pressure. Now, in this case, one of the things one of the documents that came to my attention is a document that was part of the Malcolm X papers left in the family home after Betty Shabazz was killed in a accidental fire that was set by one of her grandchildren. These papers were put up for auction, actually in San Francisco, and the papers were reclaimed by the family, but not before the text of some of these letters became public. And one of them is a letter that was written in 1959 by Malcolm X to Elijah Muhammad. And this is a year after he was married to Betty Shabazz. And I think it reveals a lot about the dependence of Malcolm X on Elijah Muhammad for guidance in every aspect of his life, including his troubled marriage to Betty. And he starts by telling Elijah Muhammad about the troubles he's having. He says, "Most brothers who follow you are slow to get married. This is not because they are against women, but because you make us see the place of the man and the great responsibility involved to a sister after marrying her. If a brother means right by a believing sister, he has to move slowly from being keep from being involved with her. This creates a situation where sisters are more forward and aggressive in seeking husbands than the brothers are in seeking wives. I mention this not out of argument, disrespect, disagreement, nor to justify, but to point toward and shed more light on what created my own situation. I am not without blame or fault and have many weaknesses. I stayed single a long time because I knew my own weaknesses and shortcomings and felt that marriage would blunt my effectiveness. I just could not see where I could devote the time to a sister that is demanded by women today. And he underlines demanded. So I ducked, dodged, twisted, turned, and ran from marriage as long as I could. When I did marry, it was at a time of great mental and spiritual weakness on my part. Despite that, I didn't marry on the spur of the moment, as everyone thought. No one knows better than I how forward, fast, and aggressive even a Muslim sister can be. And I was the target increasingly, and not because I gave them hopes, as they now would have it seem. But I did see that I was weakening under the strain, so I decided to get married. I didn't marry on the spur of the moment. I deliberated long and selected carefully. I chose Betty over the others for many reasons, and even now I think she beats all the rest of them. She was physically strong, near my height, looked something like me, and seemed to be able to produce children that would be strong and resemble us both. Plus, she seemed intelligent and had trained qualifications that could be helpful to me in my work. And she was the darkest of the three. She, Betty Sue, and Evelyn, these were the three women that he was considering. And I don't go too much for real light women as a wife. Then he goes on and talks about, and he says that the main source of the trouble was based on sex, and he has sex in capital letters underlined. She placed a great deal more stress upon me than I was physically capable of doing. Please forgive me for this topic, but I feel compelled to tell you of it, and will tell it to no one else but you. At a time when I was going all out to try to keep her satisfied sexually, one day she told me we were incompatible sexually because I had never given her any real satisfaction. From then on, try as I may, I became very cool toward her. I didn't ever feel right with her in that sense. Now, what does this remind you of in terms of the candidness of this letter? What? Yeah, remember the Du Bois letter about his issues? I think that one of the things that's very striking when we look at Malcolm X in terms of his private life is how ambivalent he was about many of the things that are, well, quite frankly, just not part of the myth of Malcolm X. It's interesting that when we look at the things that we see as the prime qualities of the myth, the strength of Malcolm X, well, here you see someone who is very emotionally dependent on Elijah Muhammad. When we look at him in terms of his racial attitudes, again, very complex. He has a very extended sexual relationship, lasts for about 5 years, with a white woman during the 1940s. And in many respects, that relationship, even more than his marriage to Betty, was one that was a voluntary relationship. While what you see with respect to his relationship with Betty is that he loves her, but he loves her in part because she fits his needs as a Muslim minister. His attitudes about violence are also complex. We see Malcolm X as a person who represents black militancy in terms of assertiveness, and yet he's within an organization that restrains that militancy. For example, in 1963, in the March on Washington, members of the Nation of Islam are not even allowed to participate in the march. He goes to the march, but he stands on the sidelines. He watches the marchers, talks to reporters, criticizes the leadership of the march. But you get the sense from his criticisms that everything would be okay if he had been invited to speak at the march. So it's again a very complex attitude. Now what I'm going to play next is a scene from a documentary about Malcolm X, which I think this scene shows a crucial period of Malcolm X's transformation, and it focuses on this issue of militancy in the context of the larger black militancy of the early 1960s. Well, I think anyone watching that and watching Malcolm's performance speech at the end of that scene would understand the dilemma that Malcolm faced in 1962. Here he is telling people that under his leadership, black people would not submit to white oppression, that black people would fight back. And here we have a situation where the LA police raid the holiest place in the religion, kill people in the organization, and the response is not that different if the SCLC headquarters had been raided in Los Angeles. The same response would go to court, get a coalition of people together, and respond nonviolently. So this was a major point of departure, I think, for Malcolm X. One of the things we see him saying in his autobiography is that he began to get much more restless, much more determined to move from the apolitical orientation, this non-engagement policy of the Nation of Islam. It's one of the points that I make when I published Malcolm X's FBI file in this book. I was interested in the FBI file in part because it provided a window into Malcolm X's life other than the autobiography. The FBI, just like the FBI file on Martin Luther King, provides a way of understanding the subject of the FBI surveillance. You get it through the bias of the FBI, but you do get a window into that person's life that would otherwise not be available. But I was also interested in the question, how did the government perceive Malcolm X as a threat? And it's interesting that the FBI file, up to the point where Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam, they only have an interest in getting information about the organization, whether the Nation of Islam will turn dangerous. They see it as a religious cult, but an apolitical religious cult. It's interesting in the context now of the threat of Islamic fundamentalism. The Nation of Islam was not perceived as a security threat to the United States. You could be a member of the Nation of Islam, for example, and work for the government. But you couldn't be a member of the Nation of the Communist Party, for example, and work for the government. So clearly, it was not considered a subversive organization as of 1963. After Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam, the amount of surveillance and harassment by the FBI increases tremendously. So clearly, from the point of view of the government and the FBI, Malcolm became much more of a threat outside the Nation of Islam than inside the Nation of Islam. So what they were concerned about was not so much the racial separatist message of the nation, but rather what kinds of political implications. And for that, I think that what we see happening during the last couple of years of Malcolm's life is that he becomes much more engaged with the African American freedom struggle. It's one of the aspects that I recount in the textbook, which I assume you've read that part. And you see during 1963, Malcolm beginning to meet more often with members of other organizations. This is when he delivers his message to the grassroots, perhaps his greatest speech as a member of the Nation of Islam. It's at a conference called to bring together all the different elements in the black struggle. And for the first time, Malcolm is invited to participate and offer his own perspective. And he accepts that invitation, and after that, there are increasing contacts between grassroots leaders in the black struggle and Malcolm X. He still doesn't meet with Martin Luther King until 1964 when they have this chance meeting at the Capitol, but he meets much more with the grassroots activists. And in his speeches, that is reflected because he makes a distinction, and this is an increasing distinction between what's happening at the grassroots level and the leaders. What is his analysis of the March on Washington? Well, the March on Washington was a great idea that was being subverted by leaders like Martin Luther King and the NAACP and others. That the masses of black people coming out of Birmingham wanted to go to Washington and shut the city down. From Malcolm's perspective, that's great. That's moving in the right direction. That's the kind of militancy I'd like to see. It's those leaders who want to pacify the masses, and in his speech after the March on Washington, he directs his criticism at those leaders who are betraying the masses. During 1964, this leads, of course, to his being suspended from the Nation of Islam. He gives a speech and talks about the chickens coming home to roost after John Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963. And this is the occasion when Elijah Muhammad suspends him. Now, it's usually interpreted that Elijah Muhammad suspended him because he was embarrassed by those comments. And that's true, but you have to think about why would a leader of this separatist religious group care about whether one of his members made a speech that was deemed embarrassing. But in any case, I think that what it really was a pretext. That Malcolm X was becoming too independent, speaking out on too many issues, and for many people in the Nation of Islam was subverting the leadership role of Elijah Muhammad, becoming not only the heir apparent to Elijah Muhammad, but the person who was, while Muhammad was still alive, was becoming the real leader of the Nation of Islam. This leads to his conflict with other members of the Nation of Islam who saw themselves as more loyal to Elijah Muhammad than Malcolm X. Now, the leader of that group was Minister Louis X, later Louis Farrakhan. Louis X had been recruited to the Nation of Islam by Malcolm X. Came out of Boston, kind of a middle-class person who had turned toward the Nation of Islam, very articulate, someone who had Malcolm X's skill as an orator, someone who was capable of bringing more and more people into the Nation of Islam. And for a long time, Louis X was the protege of Malcolm X. However, in 1963, when Malcolm X begins to talk about Elijah Muhammad's illegitimate children and began to talk more forcefully on political issues, Louis X begins to break away from Malcolm X. This culminates, one of the grounds in which the struggle is carried on is over Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali. Some of you know that Malcolm X was very crucial in terms of turning Cassius Clay toward the Nation of Islam and seeing him as a person who could potentially be the greatest recruiter that the Nation of Islam ever had. So Malcolm X cultivated his friendship with Muhammad Ali. After Muhammad Ali wins the heavyweight championship fight and announces that he's a member of the Nation of Islam, this of course leads to a storm of criticism of him. But Malcolm X becomes a very close friend of Muhammad Ali. So there's a struggle over the loyalty of Muhammad Ali. Is he going to move toward Malcolm X, or is he going to stay loyal to Elijah Muhammad? And in this crucial struggle, most of the people in the Nation of Islam place their bets with Elijah Muhammad, stay loyal to him. And when Malcolm X makes his break after serving his suspension, it becomes clear that he's not going to be invited back to the leadership role he once had. He breaks with the Nation of Islam and ultimately forms his own organization, the Organization of African American Unity. Only a handful of the people who had been his allies in the Nation of Islam join him in the new organization. This is obviously a very great disappointment, and he's particularly disappointed in Louis Farrakhan, Louis X at that point, who had been his protege, and Muhammad Ali. Once he does make the break and he begins to form the Organization of African American Unity, the opposition from within the Nation of Islam is not as strong as when Malcolm X begins to make open criticisms of Elijah Muhammad and ultimately form his own religious organization as a rival to the Nation of Islam. Louis X, Louis Farrakhan, becomes the leader of this anti-Malcolm group within the Nation of Islam. In 1964, he sends an open telegram warning Malcolm that the Nation of Islam shall no longer tolerate your scandalizing the name of Elijah Muhammad. And in an article in the final call in the Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper of the Nation of Islam, says, "The die is set, and Malcolm shall not escape, especially after such evil, foolish talk about his benefactor, Elijah Muhammad. Such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death, and would have met death if it had not been for Muhammad's confidence in Allah for victory over his enemies." Well, publishing an article like this is basically like publishing a hunting license for anyone in the Nation of Islam to go after Malcolm, and within 3 months Malcolm is assassinated. But before that happens, Malcolm reaches out to his allies in a number of ways. I mentioned in the textbook a meeting with members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee by chance in Nairobi as the SNCC workers were going through Africa, making contacts with African nationalists. Malcolm X is also going through Africa, making contacts on the African continent. They happen to meet up in Nairobi, and that meeting becomes the beginning of a dialogue afterwards that involves Malcolm X inviting members of the nation of SNCC to come to New York. Fannie Lou Hamer and people in Mississippi accept the invitation, and also members of SNCC invite Malcolm X to come south to help the movement. And eventually Malcolm X accepts this invitation, and that's what leads him to go to Selma in early 1965. Just a few things about these meetings. I think that they are extremely important. They're within a few months of Malcolm X's assassination. The Spike Lee film, for example, I think would have been a much stronger and more interesting film if he had given more attention to these last few months of Malcolm X's life. Part of this, I understand from Spike Lee, was just simply financial. That he didn't get the kind of big budget that he wanted to do his epic. And I think he threw a lot of that budget into all of the early development. It really breaks down into three parts, the film. Malcolm X's formative years up to the point of his entry in the Nation of Islam, his time in the Nation of Islam, which is basically a period, lots of speeches and that scene with Brother Johnson. And then the last third of the movie is his break with Elijah Muhammad. But that is conveyed not through any really serious discussion of where Malcolm was going politically, but rather lots of scenes of Malcolm X waiting for assassination. That's the only way I can describe it. It's literally waiting for the telephone to ring. Sitting around apartments, you see him kind of watching the television screen, and there's this activist movement going on, but he's literally paralyzed as he waits to be assassinated. What you don't see, and what I think would have made the film a lot more interesting, would have been a film, for example, a scene where Malcolm X is meeting with Fannie Lou Hamer in New York. I have a picture of that rally, and Fannie Lou Hamer is in a position of respect and admiration as she's treated as this heroic figure from the Mississippi struggle. And Malcolm X pledges to do what he can to help the voting rights struggle that's going on in the South. Just a few weeks later, Malcolm X goes to Selma at the invitation of the young activists at Tuskegee and other places in Alabama, who are then carrying on this voting rights campaign that culminates in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Malcolm X goes there and delivers a speech which I think, again, is a crucial speech for Malcolm's transition, because he says that he's in back of the voting rights struggle 100%. And I believe that black people have the absolute right to use whatever means are necessary to gain the vote, he says. Now, he also meets Coretta Scott King. He tries to meet with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is arrested a few days earlier. If that had not happened, who's to say what that first extended meeting with Martin Luther King would have resulted in. But clearly, one of the things he wanted to do while in Selma was to meet with King, discuss the situation. He meets with Coretta, and he says, I really did come thinking that I could make it easier. If white people realize what the alternative is, that is Malcolm X, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King. And it's also during this time that Malcolm X and some of the people close to him, including Clarence Jones, who has spoken in this class, try to arrange a meeting of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in New York. Among those who were active in this, Sidney Poitier, the actor, tries to make this arrangement. Bayard Rustin, who knew both of them, Rustin had debated Malcolm X, so he was clearly on the other side from Malcolm X, but he felt that Martin Luther King should meet Malcolm so that they would gain a greater understanding of their perspectives. Probably this meeting would have happened if not for the assassination of Malcolm X. Now, just a few words about the assassination. There's been lots of conspiracy theories about who was responsible for the assassination, and clearly these conspiracy theories were aided by the fact that one of the first people to come forward when Malcolm X is assassinated and was photographed with the body of Malcolm X at the Audubon Auditorium was an undercover agent for the who had worked with the New York Police Department. But I think it's pretty clear that many people in the Nation of Islam wanted Malcolm dead. And it wasn't necessarily because of his politics, but because of what in the newspaper article was called scandalizing his name. That is, the bad things that Malcolm X was saying about Elijah Muhammad. And these particularly had to do with the illegitimate children. But I think that it's interesting to point out that during this time also, Malcolm X was becoming more hard-hitting in his criticism of Elijah Muhammad's political perspective. And I'll just read a little bit from a speech that he gives just a week before his assassination. In this speech, he talks about why it was that the Black Muslim movement, as he says, was organized in such a way that it attracted the most militant, most uncompromising, most fearless, and the youngest of black people in the United States. That's who went into it, those who didn't mind dying. They didn't mind making a sacrifice, he said. And what they were interested in was freedom and justice and equality, and they would do anything to see that it was brought about. These were the people who have followed Elijah Muhammad these past 12 years. The government knows it, but all these upfront militants have been held in check by an organization that doesn't take an active part in anything. And therefore it cannot be a threat to anybody because it's not going to do anything against anybody but itself. Then he goes on to talk about an incident that happened several years earlier in 1960. He says, why do they throw a bomb at my house? Why don't they bomb the Klan? I'm going to tell you why. In 1960, December of 1960, I was in the home of Jeremiah, the minister in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm ashamed to say it, but I'm going to tell you the truth. I sat at the table myself with the heads of the Ku Klux Klan. I sat there myself with the heads of the Klan who at that time were trying to negotiate with Elijah Muhammad so that they could make it available to him a large area of land in Georgia. They had some very responsible persons in the government who were involved in it who were willing to go along with it. They wanted to make this land available to him so that his program of separation would sound more feasible to Negroes and thereby lessen the pressure that the integrationists were putting on the white man. I sat there, I negotiated it, I listened to their offer. And I was the one who went back to Chicago and told Elijah Muhammad what they offered. Now that was December of 1960. The code name that Jeremiah gave the Klan leader was 666. Whenever they would refer to him, they would refer to him as Old Six. What his name right now escapes me, but they even sat there and told stories how Jeremiah was there and his wife was there and I was there and the Klan was there. From that day onward, the Klan never interfered with the Black Muslim movement in the South. Jeremiah attended Klan rallies, as you read on the front page of the New York Tribune. They never bothered him, never touched him, never touched a Muslim. And a Muslim never touched him. Elijah Muhammad would never let me go back since January of 1961. I never went south as long as I remained in the Black Muslim movement. Whenever it happened in this country, wherever it happened in this country, where there was action, it was action I was involved in because I believed in action after leaving the Klan. I never have gone along with the Ku Klux Klan. Now it's interesting that meeting, which he talks about with the Klan, is also in the FBI file. The FBI had an informant at the meeting, so in that sense, the FBI knew what was going on. Now, I mention this as not only as a way of kind of getting beyond the Malcolm myth and Malcolm's own attempt to demythologize his role that he played within the Nation of Islam, but I think that there's an interesting parallel. One of the things, most controversial aspects of Marcus Garvey's career was his meeting with the Klan during the 1920s. I think, if anything, strengthened Du Bois's criticisms of Marcus Garvey and strengthened and what weakened Marcus Garvey's support within the black community was his meeting with the Klan. Now, from Marcus Garvey's point of view, and perhaps from Elijah Muhammad's point of view, their notion that, well, if all white men are devils, why does it matter whether I meet with the Klan or whether I meet with the NAACP, for that matter? They're all part of the enemy, and for that reason he felt that it was quite legitimate meeting with them. But I think what this does is it draws attention to what I would call the dilemma of an apolitical movement. And that is, if you withdraw from politics, does that mean that you're non-political? If you refuse to engage in political action, is that a political statement on its own? And if you have any kind of relations in terms of discussions and negotiations with elements in the white community, what are the implications of that for the black struggle? I think for Malcolm X, that meeting in 1960 was the beginning of the end of his relationship with the Nation of Islam. I think that what we need now is a more careful study of what did he learn from that, and the political lessons to be learned from the last year of Malcolm X. Unfortunately, I don't think that Spike Lee's movie provides that political education. Maybe we should all go out and raise some money and allow Spike Lee to make the film he might have made if he had had a $100 million budget. Any questions, comments? Just maybe time for one question.
Can you
Okay.
repeat those three questions? Those are really good questions.
At the end?
Yes.
Well, does someone write them down?
Refusal to engage
Yeah,
in political action, a political statement.
Right.
If you have any kind of relations in regards to negotiations and settlements with any people in the white community, what are the implications of that in the struggle?
Yeah, actually, the similar kind of situation came up with the Congress of Racial Equality when they turned toward black separatism in the late 1960s and made a deal with the Nixon administration to gain land in North Carolina, which became Soul City. And there was a lot of criticism of, well, you're saying that black people should be separatists, but you're making a deal with the Nixon administration to get this land. And so that issue comes up often in African American black nationalist politics. See you on Thursday.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.